psychology. So let's jump in and continue our look at the different categories of mental illness. And we're going to continue here with personality disorders as well as dissociative disorders. And these are two separate categories. And this is going to be one of those videos that you're probably going to need to or want to pause as we go through this. And possibly even review, because some of the symptoms and descriptions can be a little lengthy and somewhat confusing. So I'm just kind of giving you a heads up before we get started. So let's go ahead and go. So we need to clarify some vocabulary here up front. And we're going to start with dissociative disorders. And I think it's important to understand what the word dissociation actually means. And we all do this. We all do this all the time. Dissociation is really just like daydreaming, or when you get lost in the moment and you're working on a project and you just kind of let your mind wander. And that's just dissociation. You've separated yourself from whatever is meant to be the task at hand. But that doesn't make it an abnormal behavior. We've got to have some of these other criterias here. So a dissociative disorder is characterized by separation of critical parts of your personality, things like your memory, your consciousness, or your identity. And those critical parts of your personality that are normally integrated and they work together. Now, with a dissociative disorder, suddenly it means that those parts of your personality are no longer working together. They have disassociated, they've gotten lost from one another. Now, it's very common for all of us to experience what we'd call a temporary dissociative states. I know you can all relate to that experience of maybe driving and you're in your car and somehow you can't remember how you got from one street to the next, and that memory, it's like it's just vanished. And that's a moment of dissociation. But again, that doesn't mean you have any type of disorder. That's just a moment in time where you've had a moment of dissociation. We are not talking about a critical separation of parts of your memory and consciousness. That could be an ongoing issue. So when we talk about dissociative disorders, the most common one that we are going to focus on is what's called dissociative identity disorder, most commonly known as DID. It makes it much easier to say. Dissociative identity disorder. Many people will still refer to it as the former name, which was a multiple personality disorder. And with DID, dissociative identity disorder, a person appears to have two or more very distinct personalities. And these personalities can speak, they carry out tasks, and they even write, and sometimes in very different handwriting. Even sometimes somebody could be right-handed, one personality, and the other personality could be a left-hander. These different personalities even have their own distinct memories, wishes, goals, impulses, and very often the impulses of one of these identities conflict with one of the other identities. The problem, however, is because there's only one body for this personality. And in order for these personalities to emerge, they have to take turn. And very often they're personalities that can be very strong and dominant. There can be differences in ages. There can be differences in gender. And so their personalities and their behavior can appear to be very inconsistent because of all of these variations. There are some famous cases of DID. While in society it is generally not a very common disorder. It is not very common, and that'll lead us into a few more slides in terms of the public perception of DID. Herschel Walker, an incredible running back in the NFL, he is a person who struggled with DID, and he, struggled to manage these personalities. Another famous case of DID was by the name of Chris Sizemore, and back in the 1950s, there was an incredibly famous movie called The Three Faces of Ease. And if you're an old movie fanatic, this might be a movie that might draw you in now because of the psychology connection. In the movie, three of those personalities are depicted. There's a very shy, meek, boring, ordinary Eve White, and then there's also Eve Black, very dominant, carefree, and then there's the older version, and her name was Jane. And very often in DID, these different personalities, they're going to go by different names because they are very unique, and they're very aware of one another. It's fascinating. It truly is. But probably the most infamous case of DID, dissociative identity disorder, was the case of Shirley Mason. And in pop culture, she was referred to as Sybil. And her story begins in the 1950s. She was a student at Columbia, and she would suffer from these blackouts and emotional breakdowns. And finally, she found her way into psychotherapy, and the sessions that she had in therapy became the basis of a super famous popular book. I believe it came out in the 1970s, that was called Sybil, and this has also been made into a movie as well. She continued to live a fulfilling life, learning how to handle and deal with all of these multiple personalities. So on this slide here, this is a sampling of these personalities that she had. And if you want to stop and pause on the screen to take in all of this, and you can see the variation in ages, gender, personalities of all of these different identities. It's truly fascinating and hard to take in. So the development of DID, where does it come from? So when we are looking at disorders, we are considering them, and we need to look at them and think about them from the perspective of some of these different schools of psychology. So from the psychoanalytic perspective, their belief is that there's some massive repression of unwanted impulses or memories, and that they are actually trying to create a new person who's acting out otherwise unacceptable impulses, or trying to retaliate against a memory that they don't want to deal with in their true identity. A behaviorist would believe that everyone is capable of acting in different ways in different situations. We all do that. Different social settings, different classrooms even. But the disorder is the extreme variation of acting so differently that you actually feel like a different person. The reward comes, and this is how it becomes a behavioral theory. The reward comes, or it's strengthened by the reward, that the memory loss or that shifting personality allows the person to escape that stressful situation. So in that reward, this becomes a behavioral theory. So evaluating the causes of DID is really difficult. And like I said earlier, this is an incredibly rare disorders. Most clinicians, most people who would diagnose somebody, believe that there has probably been some sort of trauma or abuse that happened to the person in childhood, and that the way that they are learning to deal with the situation is to separate themselves from that true identity. There are many, many people who do not believe it's an actual disorder, and they believe that a person is being very creative and maybe, a con artist and trying to draw attention to themselves in order to ease some of the tension and anxiety that they have in their life. So the next category we're going to go into is personality disorders. And this is where I'm warning you up front, you're probably going to need to hit pause a few times to get some of this information in. So hopefully you've got your notes ready to go, and you can keep them organized if you're using the guided notes, or add some things in the margin as you need to do to take all of this in. So when we are looking at personality disorders, in general, the overriding description is that they are long-standing, inflexible personality traits that impair our social functioning. Okay, so there has to be a history of it. And people, when we talk about it as being something that is inflexible, it means that it is has a strong hold in their personality, and it keeps them from having traditional, typical, normal social relationships. We're going to look at these disorders in 3 different clusters. And within each of these clusters, there's going to be a number of specific disorders. So the first cluster, cluster A, these are going to be individuals who exhibit odd or eccentric behavior, kind of out there. Cluster B, these individuals exhibit dramatic or emotional traits. And cluster C exhibit anxious or fearful behavior. Now, in terms of how these people are identified as having personality disorders, typically it's because there has been some outside entity, whether it's family or possibly even the court system, who has told them that they need to seek treatment. So their personality is their own. And, that's just who they are. And they live with that person. They personally don't feel distressed by their condition. But what is often happening is their personality, this disorder for them, is dysfunctional in the world around them. And so that's how it becomes a disorder. So let's begin with cluster A, and one of those specific disorders within cluster A is what we're going to call a paranoid personality disorder. And this is going to be characterized by paranoia, which can be described as having a really deep sense, a very long-standing, so it's played out over and over in their personality. They are suspicious and they don't trust other people. There's somebody out to get them. Nobody is going to do right by me. Paranoid personality. The next one in this cluster is a schizoid personality. And these are individuals who have a pattern of indifference to social relationship with a limited range of emotional expression and experience. Indifference. They don't really care. They're kind of flat. They don't really care if they have friends. They don't care if people like them. Typically, schizoid personality manifests itself in early adulthood, and you start seeing people detach themselves socially and emotionally from other people. They don't really care if people come into their lives or if people leave their lives. They're not going to get upset by a lost friendship. They may not seek out the feeling and sense of loneliness, may not be a real emotion for them. The third one in this cluster is what's called schizotypal. And this is a pattern of social and interpersonal difficulties that includes a sense of discomfort with close relationships. There's often eccentric behavior and unusual thoughts and perceptions of reality. So they usually have kind of a distorted pattern of thinking. Their behavior is going to be a little strange. That's where the word eccentric comes in. And they don't want close relationships with people. And that, comes from their distorted thinking. So let's add one or two more things to the description here of the paranoid personality disorder. So I mentioned that they often display pervasive distrust and suspiciousness. And some of those things that are present in their mind are some of these bullet points that you see here. It's that distrust and suspiciousness. They believe that somebody is out to get them. They believe that a partner or a spouse is unfaithful. They don't trust their friends. They believe that any information that they give to someone is going to be used against them. There's some underlying motive that everybody has if they're wanting to develop some type of relationship with them. And those are some of the underlying, this extends our details about the paranoid personality disorder a bit more. So the next cluster, the next set of personality disorders in cluster B, the first one is borderline personality disorder. And we'll go into more detail on this specific one as well in the next slide. But in general, borderline personality is marked by an ongoing pattern of varying moods, self-image, and behavior. And very often someone with borderline personality disorder, they are very impulsive. And this results in having relationships, problems in some of their relationships. We'll go into more of that here in just a minute. Histrionic personality disorder, and these are going to be ones that you are somewhat familiar with. Histrionic personality, these are going to be people that have a behavior that is very attention-seeking. Okay, and typically histrionic patterns emerge in early adulthood, and very often these result in inappropriate seductive behaviors, and they are seeking approval at a level that is not normal. We all want to hear praise, and we all want to have the approval of our friends and our family, but histrionics seek that approval, which explains some of their seductive behavior. And getting the approval or the acceptance of a sexual partner fits right into the histrionic personality. One of the ways I remember histrionic is if you have a hissy fit, if you've ever heard that phrase, that is related to being histrionic because it's excessive attention-seeking emotion. I have a hissy fit. I'm excessively emotional. And then the third one that falls in here, and another one, again, you're probably familiar with this, and that's a narcissist or the narcissistic personality. And they have a long pattern, and all of these personality disorders for cluster B, these are being watched and being developed over a long period of time. We all have moments where we display some of these different types of personality characteristics. But the key with personality disorders is these are characterized by observing behavior over a long period of time. A narcissist, their behavior is, we're going to see it in exaggerated feelings of self-importance. And they have an excessive need for admiration, and they have very little empathy towards others. Do we know people like that? Yes, but we need to see this in a long-term pattern. So let's go back to borderline personality disorder and look at some important additional details. So they have a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, self-perception, how they see themselves, their moods. They have a really hard time with impulse control. And when a diagnosis is going to be made for borderline personality disorder, it's going to require at least 5 of the following. And there's a number of things there that are alarming. And, we talk about these frantic efforts to avoid expected abandonment. Again, that falls back into that idea that someone is going to leave them, and distrust. Marked impulsivity, and the concern that they could be potentially self-damaging to themselves. Just ongoing feeling of emptiness, inappropriate and intense anger. Borderline personality disorders very often might resort to drug abuse, alcohol abuse. It's not uncommon at all. Okay, and now there's a 4th one that goes in this cluster. I didn't have it on the original slide, but the 4th personality disorder for cluster B is what's known as antisocial personality disorder. And of all of them, this is probably the most well known. You can look here at these bullet points, and in order to be diagnosed, the clinical features must include 3 of the following: lack of conforming to laws. So they are very often committing crimes, and they have a history in the criminal justice system. Repeated deceitfulness in relationships. Okay, they lie. They lie to their friends. They lie to the people that are in a loving relationship with them, and they do it for profit or pleasure. They don't think ahead. They are very impulsive. Okay, they lack that cognitive problem solving, some of those features that we take for granted. They have a tendency to be very irritable, very angry. They hurt other people. They get into fights very frequently. And they disregard personal safety or the safety of others. Weapons charges, pulling knives on people in order to get what they want. The term antisocial, okay, they don't like to be around other people. They don't follow the norms of society. They are antisocial. So the thing about antisocial disorder is that this is a disorder that cannot be diagnosed until someone is 18 years old. They have to show a history of some of these symptoms, however, since they were 15. There has to be some paperwork. And if you think back and look at some of those clinical features, and you look at some of those descriptions there, the deceitfulness, the lack of conforming to laws, if a person has antisocial personality disorder, they probably have already established some type of track record, either in the courts or even in schools. And so that information is going to be available. Antisocial personalities typically occur more often in males, and the term sociopath or psychopath is often interchanged with this, but in terms of how it's described in the DSM-5, it's referred to as antisocial personality disorder. Many studies suggest that there is a possible genetic predisposition to this, meaning it can run in a family. They cite that there is a chronic, meaning ongoing, under arousal in the autonomic and central nervous systems, which means that, it's natural. We need to wake up. We need to respond to things. But if they don't have that type of arousal, they actually become less sensitive to punishment, meaning, I don't care. And if you don't care, you're more likely to carry out behaviors and, interact with other people in a way that can be detrimental. Other research shows that they have an underdeveloped amygdala. Okay, so fear, emotion, and if it's underdeveloped, if there's a lack of fear, you're going to carry out and do things that could, for most people, have some pretty severe consequences. And then we can add on maybe some of the sociocultural components of this, environmental factors, based on the type of family that you grew up in. Did you have models who were available to, show you that you may be behavioral, that you learned from? And all of these things could possibly cause APD, or antisocial personality disorder. You can take a look here at these images here, and PET scans of 41 murderers, people in the prison system, revealed reduced activity in the frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes is where you have decision-making abilities. So if it's not working and actively making those choices, you're going to make bad choices. You've looked at and you've seen information already about some of these neurodevelopmental disorders, and these are disorders that occur in children, and that's why they are called neurodevelopment disorders. Okay, they are not personality disorders. However, those characteristics, I put them here because I don't want you to get confused and think that this is the category that they belong in. These are childhood disorders. However, you could say that these are childhood personality disorders, and you have conduct disorder and you have oppositional defiant disorder already in your notes. The last cluster includes avoidant personality, which is characterized by feelings of social inhibition, inadequacy. You're very sensitive to negative criticism, rejection. A dependent personality, you don't want to be alone. And if you are alone, you experience symptoms of anxiety, and you constantly need reassurance from others. Again, we all experience these types of personalities. We all have moments where we don't want to be alone, but we've got to witness and observe this ongoing behavior. And then the last one is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and that's really important that you add that in there. These are two separate disorders. Okay, don't get it confused with obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an anxiety disorder. The personality disorder is characterized by some of the same things: a preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental and interpersonal control at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency. The difference here lies where the personality disorder, this may not be something that controls a person's life and results in stress. They may not feel anxious and stressed if something is not in line the way they want to. They just accept it as this is who they are and this is how it is. As opposed to OCD, the anxiety disorder, if things don't go the way they want them to, if things aren't in order, if things aren't perfect, it will result in anxious behavior and feelings of anxiety. So there you go. Whew, take a deep breath. There was a lot to take in this video, and we'll keep going next time for our study of clinical psychology.